Okay, here we are with a discussion and rationale for cross-fiber manipulation. Now, I just want you to understand that this technique does not stand alone. That what we're doing when we manipulate muscles with a cross-fiber technique is very consistent with a lot of the latest research that's happening at the moment. And so I've described this as a discussion and rationale because it literally is a discussion. We have not nailed down why cross-fiber technique and fascial manipulation works as well as it does scientifically, but there's many other fields that are affecting fascia in similar ways. So I explained that the manipulation that we're using and I've demonstrated involves locking your thumb or fingers onto the skin and firmly and slowly gliding across the perpendicular across the fibers of the muscle beneath. And I've suggested that what you're probably affecting is the fascia between the skin and the muscle. So what's really going on physiologically? And that's a great question that I'm not going to answer comprehensively, but let me give you a few things to think about. Firstly, there's lots of things going on. The answer to this question just ain't simple, but one thing that we've recently learned with functional anatomy is that fascia is highly innervated. The fascial matrix throughout the body has some 6 times the innervation of skeletal muscle. And so, such a richly innervated nerve supply for the fascia really says something about this being a thinking organ, not just a dumb white substance that holds stuff together. They've figured out that fascia has proprioceptive properties. They've figured out that fascia most likely, yet to be confirmed, has nociceptive or pain-sending properties. And they describe fascia now as a biotensegrity model or a matrix rather than flat sheets as it has been previously thought to comprise. A good example of manipulating fascia to get pain relief is Ron Alexander's functional fascial taping. Now, I've done a course with Ron, and many of you may have as well. He's an Aussie guy who's worked in the ballet industry. He's a myotherapist, and he's developed a technique by which he uses strapping tape to create tension on the skin overlying the site of injury. This is amazingly effective. He produces a tension on the skin in a direction often different to the direct line of the muscle pull. And he finds that not only does manipulating the skin like this reduce pain, but it enables the athlete or the patient to resume full load-bearing exercise. And not only that, even more amazingly, as they load and use the limb, the injury heals under use. Just extraordinary. It's similar in some respects to the fact that static load is being used these days for Achilles tendinopathy or plantar fasciopathy. So what previously used to be treated with ice and stretch, they've now realized that fascia, those tendons, are thinking and literally remodel themselves under load. Going back to Ron's technique, note that what Ron's doing with that tape is he's not actually stabilizing the joint. So we see a lot of taping where you see a football player with all the strapping on his shoulder to basically help hold his glenohumeral joint together and make up for the lax ligaments because he's dislocated it too many times. Ron's taping is not doing this at all. It's empowering full range of movement in the joint, and it's literally just putting tension on the skin. And that seems to affect the fascia underneath and affect the pain pathways. Intriguing. Now, I've also used what I call dynamic dry needling. I call it dynamic because it's using press needles, these tiny little press needles that at their longest are 1.5 mil long. And by leaving needles on sites for days at a time, you get a dynamic effect. Of course, those needles are going to be stimulating the fascia just under the skin, and they're going to be affecting function as the patient moves. So I've combined some ideas that I've stolen from Ron's functional approach, and I've combined it with the knowledge that the superficial fascia, that is the fascia that's immediately underneath the skin, is the most highly innervated. And taking those two ideas together, I've decided that a very, very small needle inserted that's only 1.5 mil into the skin, it's not even reaching the muscle beneath, it's literally only skin deep, seems to get a functional change. And so I'll use these press needles on stubborn sites of myofascial restriction where the trigger points present have struggled to resolve. One example is in glute medius near the sacroiliac joint where there's dysfunction there. Now you can imagine putting a 1.5 mil needle into that gluteal area is probably not going to do anything at all. There's often a lot of fatty tissue there. And so there's layers of adipose tissue, of fascia, and that needle is literally going nowhere near the muscle. It is literally just under the skin. And yet, the amazing results that seem to be accomplished again and again by leaving that needle on there for a number of days as the person goes about their function. Okay, so why does this cross-fiber manipulation work? But skeletal muscles do move in lines of pull, right? So although we know that this doesn't happen in a detached, individualistic way as previously imagined, we know now that it's in a much more integrated way, where a muscle exerts force not only on the tendons at either end, but also on adjacent muscles, fascia, and skin. We could say it's still generally true that fascia around and within a given muscle is primarily subjected to load in one direction. So let's describe that as north-south. Just imagine that erector spinae, for example. So if the fascial complex, including the muscle, the epimysium, superficial fascia, skin complex, has bound or tightened in a dysfunctional way, I suggest that it's going to be in that line of pull, in that north-south kind of pull. And so stimulating that area with an east-west type of manipulation, or a manipulation that's perpendicular to the muscle fibers, does that somehow stimulate a healing response in the fascia? What physiologically is this manipulation triggering? I don't really know, but the clinical observations, the increasing number of techniques and therapies that are subscribing to various means of cross-fiber stretch and manipulation of the skin, whether it's taping or whatever, and the reason these are growing is because the body responds so incredibly well to these techniques. So in my observation, the manipulation that I'm doing is not forcing a change, but stimulating a response. We'll talk more about that in another module. In my observation, the range of movement is restored quickly, enabling a dynamic treat, assess, treat method. In my observations, tenderness is often resolved almost instantly, and proprioception is restored almost instantly as well. This is most obvious in the perineal muscles when it comes to weak ankles that want to roll. Just imagine how brief manipulation as a therapist could save your body from all that hard work. Just imagine how brief manipulation could enable you to cover more regions in one treatment. And imagine when the clothing and the skin are one and you manipulate the skin through the clothing, just how much time it saves you when the patient does not have to disrobe. In short, what I'm talking about can revolutionize your treatment regime. I hope this little discussion and rationale has been helpful, interesting, but above all, given some credence to the fact that this form of manipulation, I think, is where it's all heading.